Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this little study as we continue this week. We are in the book of Judges, chapter 2, and hopefully you can see that on the screen here. We're picking up at verse 12. And again, this is a very sad, you know, episode here as we continue, and we see the children of Israel, the nation of Israel, turning from God and serving false gods. And so verse 12 and 13 are kind of tied together. So I want to point out something somewhat interesting there. Verse 12 says, "They forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods of the gods of the people that were around about them, and bowed themselves unto them, and provoked the Lord to anger." Very strong statement, very horrible situation as they're describing this. But then when it comes to verse 13, it looks like it's a repetition. It says, "And they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth." And the commentators are very quick to jump on this and saying that this is not just a oversight. This is a repetition to emphasize how bad things have gotten. You notice in verse 12, it is lacking the names of Baal and Ashtaroth. And of course, we know from the previous session that Baal is not a name. It just means the master. And so they forsook the Lord and served a different master. And what the sages point out here is that the um, the Bible doesn't really like to include the names of false gods. It mainly desires to stay focused on the one true God and not give any press, if you will, or any notoriety to false gods. But and so that's why verse 12 it just has the names, Elohim, and or the title Elohim, and doesn't have the names. But because this decline into false gods was so deep and so severe. Verse 13 came in with the names just to point out just how low they had sunk. It's meant to serve a strong emphasis, saying, "Look how far from God, the one true God, they have gone." And went and served these others. Now we know too that names in the Bible um, don't always represent names the way we understand them today, but that they have a meaning. Every name has a history behind it of why that name was given. And so one of the fascinating things of gaining deeper insight into the Word of God is to look at these names. So we're going to take a look at the name Ashtaroth. And of course, you have to dig a little bit because many of the dictionaries, lexicons will just say, "Oh, it's just the name of a Canaanite goddess." But there is a little bit deeper meaning that we can find in some of the dictionaries of the uh, Targumim, which is the extra biblical literature that the um, rabbis wrote that was in their verbal oral tradition, but was later written down um, in about 900 AD. So this is where we gain a little bit of insight. So Ashtaroth is really star. It's very similar to the name Esther, which also means star. But again, two opposite ends of the spectrum. Esther being a very righteous, pious lady, and Ashtaroth, we're going to find is exactly the polar opposite of it. And so Ashtaroth is a feminine goddess, and this was tied to fertility cult, which means that this was taking sexual immorality to its deepest level of horribleness, if you will. And so this is tied in with the goddess, later to be called goddess of Venus when we get into, or when society picks up in the Greek culture and the gods and demigods of the Greek mythology start coming in. Venus was somewhat the later version of who Ashtaroth was. And so the goddess of love and fortune. And then what was also interesting here is up in this little upper right corner is a little inset taken from the Aramaic, where it talks about um, the basis for this word comes from a depth where the sun cannot penetrate. Insinuating that this was very dark, very without light, without wholesomeness, without sustenance of goodness at all. It was just a very deep, dark place. And here's where you get where Ashtaroth is coming in. And of course, what made this so horrible is that this goddess would demand um, uh, worship in the form of prostitution. They didn't have priests and priestesses except for um, to solicit funds from the adherents, and they did that through prostitution and sexual immorality. Again, we know that that is a destructive force to the family unit. It is a destructive force to the institution of marriage that God has ordained and blessed and or introduced and blessed and ordained. And so this was a target right at the institution of the family. Again, you can see some of that really playing out in today's society, but it's what we see today is nothing new. It's just a repackaging of what has existed for the centuries. So again, this was a horrible, horrible thing. And when we get to verse 14, we see that the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And here's where I want to take you into just a little bit of the Hebrew, because one of the things that people often challenge. People who are trying to live for God is that, oh, the God of the Old Testament was just angry and, judgmental and you know God in the New Testament through Jesus is seen as loving and kind and merciful. What's up here with that? Is there it's difficult for them to grasp that. And we're going to find here that a lot of that has to do with the mindset of the translators. Little inset here of verse 14 in Bible Hub, and I'm going to go to it in this click here, that the topic of anger is very wide open in Hebrew. Remember, Hebrew is a language of emotions, of poetry, of feelings. It is not a scientific language. And so there's not a lot of words in biblical Hebrew, approximately 5 to 7,000. And so words will have many different meanings. Compare that to English and modern day Israeli or Hebrew, which has over 1 million of them. And so words have different meanings and take different contexts depending upon how it's being used. And these couple words here to describe what God was feeling is very, very interesting. When I came across this and learned about it, it was very enlightening, and it helped me understand in a better way that God is a very emotional God, that He has feelings as we have feelings, and that those feelings can be um, hurt, and His feelings can be um, broken. His trust in us, or we can break his heart, is probably a better way to put it. And so let's look at the word Vayichar Af. You'll see a little line here. It's called a makef. It ties these two words together, and they're intended to be said as like they are one word. So Vayachar Af. And so when we look at Vayachar and open that up to see its root meaning, it is the word chara, which is to be warm, to burn. And of course, some of these meanings come from the Middle Ages, when these translations from Hebrew into English were getting their momentum. But if you look at in the NASB translation, all the different options they have for this word chara can be furious, which is very intense. It can be fret, which is very light. It can be zealous, it can be angry, it can be raged, it could be kindled. So this word, even the word became, which is also a very non-intensive um, form of use of the word. So understanding that, we can look at this and say, okay, well, how angry was God? It's the translators here said, and he was hot. Okay, well, how hot is hot? Is anything above 98.6? Where we gain some understanding is when we look at the form of the verb here. Hebrew has 7 different verb conjugations, and they change in intensity or they change in form of relationship. The first one being a cal, which is QAL, is more of a textbook type use of the word. It has no intensity, no emotion tied to it at all. It's just the word, and you have no indication as to how the user or the speaker is feeling. Now, I would have expected this to be in what was called a PL form, which is a very intensive, very factative type use of the word. It's one of the more intensive forms, meaning, he was just burning over, he was hot and tense, slamming his fist on the table, face was all red, and just steam coming out of his ears. That would be a PL form. Notice that this word is not in a PL form. It is in a CAL form. It's in a textbook form, just saying he had this emotion. He was feeling, could have been, we look at the usage of this word, he could have just been feeling warm. He could have been feeling frustrated. It shows that something was happening within him. And that's interesting here because it was only the translators that took it as being hot. The next word we want to look at is anger. So let's open this up, and you're going to find something quite interesting here, that the word for anger is the word for nose. Well, this is quite a deep study here, taking us into what this word for nose could mean. In the NASB, it's translated 205 times as anger, angry, but it can mean nose, it can mean wrath, it could mean breath. It could mean before, many different choices here. But what's important to know is where this came from. And again, lots of study we could go into. I'll kind of give you a condensed version here, but this term here of Vayichar-af is a term that comes from the nomads of those that had camels and use them for their transportation, use them for moving things around. And when a camel is overloaded and has more on its back than it can bear, it will flare its nostrils and it will snort and it will stand still. And so this term vayichar af comes from those that nomads and what they saw their camels to um, exhibit when they were asked to do something that was beyond what they wanted to do, was beyond their capability. The load was too heavy. And so the camel would flare its nostrils. And so this term here is being applied to God over what has happened. Was God affected by this? Of course, the people have turned away from God and they were serving other gods. But what kind of emotion did God feel from these words here, and seeing that this is not in a rage, fly off the handle, throw dishes and pots and pans around type of anger? This is in a frustration. This is where God is basically put in a position beyond what his control is, what he doesn't want to be in, and he's feeling all kinds of emotions of frustration, of betrayal, of hurt, very similar to what a woman would feel if she found out her husband was cheating on her. Yes, she would be angry, but that would not be the main emotion. She would feel a range of emotions of insecurity of what's going to happen to the family. How's this going to affect the children? What are the parents going to say? The in-laws going to say? What are the neighbors going to feel? How is this going to affect their likelihood, their relationship? How are they ever going to come back and have a good marriage again? This is the type of emotion that God was feeling, characterized here by Vayichar Af. And when I see this, it just puts it in a much better perspective that fits so much better into what we see Jesus sharing with us as he describes his love for us and his frustration and brokenheartedness when we and do the wrong thing and when we go astray. So we're not seeing two different emotions of God between the Old Testament and New Testament. We're just seeing a difference in how translators and mankind perceived God's emotion. And that's what makes the study of the Hebrew so beautiful, to gain that perspective and to gain an understanding of the heart of God, that God is still a God of love in the Old Testament, just like he is in the New Testament. In fact, the choice of the word, or the use of the word Yahweh here, shows God's compassion, because that is his merciful, compassionate side. If he really wanted to display anger and vengeance and wrath, it would have used the word Elohim, which stands for that side of God, which we do see. But here, in the midst of the Israelites turning to other lovers, if you will, other masters, God is feeling the rejection. He's feeling the brokenheartedness. He's wondering how this relationship is ever going to be restored. And he's feeling all those emotions that cause him to be brokenhearted. And so I know it's a lot to take in all at once here, but we're going to leave you with that for the end of today's study. I pray that that will be a blessing to you, give you some food for thought as to how God feels when we don't always do what we should do. So God bless you. Have yourself a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye bye.